Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast, where foreign aid partners connect to learn about key funding trends and market insight. The podcast is co-hosted by Aid Connect Data, the pipeline and market intel software for USAID partnering, and Connected International, the leading USAID partnering support consulting firm. Now, here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Hello and welcome to the Aid Market Podcast. Very excited to have a special show today. We have Michael Metzler. He's the Executive Director of Private Sector Engagement at USAID. And we have regular guest and friend of the show, Randy Tift, the former Chief A&A Policy Officer at USAID, on as the first guest host in the podcast history. So Randy's going to be leading the conversation with Michael. I may jump in from time to time, but I'm actually really looking forward just to enjoying the conversation between you two. So with that, Randy, we'll turn the show over to you and look forward to the conversation with Michael about the important work USAID's done in the past with private sector engagement and some of your priorities going forward.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And yeah, really looking forward to this. The backgrounds will probably come out in some of the conversation, but I know you'll have bios in the show notes too. So Michael, greetings. Great to be with you for this conversation with the Aid Connect Aid Market podcast. And we should probably start with a big picture rundown and the history of USAID's private sector engagement. So when we say private sector engagement or PSE, we mean a lot of things, but basically business actors in global development are engaged in market-driven approaches. They're positioning countries for economic growth with targeted investment and policy change, or they're engaging in public-private partnerships to achieve development outcomes. So we saw the launch of the Global Development Alliance in the early 2000s under the Bush administration, and that continues to this day. And we saw the launch of the private sector engagement policy in 2018, and that policy is still guiding the agency's PSE work. Now, you came from the field to lead the PSE hub around that time. And so we'd love to hear your take on first the look back at some of these initiatives like the GDA, which is now called Pathways, the PSE Policy, and other things you think are significant. And we'll get to the new stuff right after that. But first, give us a look back. You can reflect, too, on this question. Many U.S. foreign assistance professionals kind of scoffed at engaging multinational corporations and even local firms whose primary motive is mere profit. But there's really been a major shift in terms of the development community engaging the private sector. What's important about that? And Michael, I think you're on mute.
Great beginning. Of course, I'm on mute. So first, let me start by saying, Mike, thanks so much for the invitation to join the podcast. Long-term fan. I've watched a lot of these in the past, and they've been really, really interesting. Of course, Randy's not only a long-term friend of the show, he's also a long-term friend of PSE and the USAID, and we had an opportunity to work together under the last administration. So Randy, both great to see you, and thanks for pulling this together. Really appreciate it. USAID has a long history of private sector engagement, longer than any other donor in this space. And it's a really interesting history and one that continues to evolve. And so, Randy, you mentioned the GDA kind of instrument. That was also the first office, first formalized private sector engagement office, dates back to 2000, actually, when they launched that office. And it was the first time the agency wanted to kind of formalize an approach and its thinking around engaging the private sector. Arguably, you could trace it even further back. I used to run the Office of Development Credit, which is known as the Development Credit Authority Office, for a bunch of years. That actually started slightly before the lab, but also another formalized attempt the agency was making to really resource and develop, be deliberate about engaging the private sector as partners. And so, if you go way back then, what did it look like at the time? Much of the early years was trying to get the programs up and running, and they took a very much corporate social responsibility bent to them. which was fine because when you're trying to start programs that literally no other donors were doing at the time, and a lot of people, to your cultural question, which I'll get to in a second, a lot of people even question the premise of working with the private sector, seeing the private sector is actually the cause of a lot of the problems that the donor community was trying to solve. Why on earth would you work with the enemy, so to speak? And so, there was a lot of cultural headwinds when the agency tried to get this up and running. And so it for a bunch of years, it just tried to prove the model by having some programs up and running that they can start pointing to say, look, it is possible and we can do this and we can keep growing it within the agency. So, throughout the 2000s, that's a lot of what we did. I was looking the other day at some of those early programs. And like I said, you'll see a lot of CSR type programs, which means, we weren't on the commercial side of our business partners' operations. We weren't appealing to the business side. We were appealing to the more philanthropic side, right? Where they wanted to work with USAID because it made them look good. There was some reputational, they got a lot of credit on the reputational side. You saw USAID in a lot of annual reports at the time where they say, look what we're doing. And it was a lot of that was like transfer of funds or resources to USAID for USAID to do its own programming. So it was USAID inviting a corporate body or a local business in to support what USAID had planned, designed, and was implementing. And they said, okay, we'll throw some money at that, maybe some people, and we're happy to do it. Over time, that started to change. And I think it started to change by folks throughout the agency saying, you know what, this doesn't seem as sustainable as it should be, right? Because once the CSR money stops flowing, once the program ends, you see a long history of projects just stopping and then nothing after, right? And so, frankly, when the Green administration had come in, when you were here, Randy, there was this desire to actually not just recognize that shift that was fairly episodic, frankly, and haphazard across the portfolio, but to actually focus on it and say, actually, that focusing on the actual commercial interests of our private sector partners is not only a good thing to do, it's an absolutely necessary thing to do. And in fact, it went forward further than that and said, it's actually the history of how we're going to do development into the future. And so out of that recognition came for the first ever PSE policy for the agency. And if you read the policy, you will see that it presents a very bold vision. And actually, I wasn't entirely engaged at the time, as Randy, as you pointed out, a lot of that I was out in the field, but I was impressed by it because what the policy did was unequivocal in its vision, which said exactly that, right? That for the future of development, first of all, we can't solve all these problems on our own by any stretch. In fact, we're falling behind in terms of resources going to the growing development problems around the world. The private sector is more engaged than it's ever been in the development space. And so they're there anyway, and they're doing what they're doing anyway. So the policy couches that as a real actually opportunity for the agency to find those partners that are already there, that are interested in expanding their commercial operations, and in so doing, can help us achieve outside development impacts and more outsized than if we just funded it ourselves and supported it ourselves. And so it was a call to action. It was a call to action to say, we got to stop having conversations with the private sector that are one, entirely driven by USAID. In fact, we need to flip that. And we have to listen to our private sector partners. What are their commercial interests? Where are they trying to expand? Where are they trying to deepen their networks or relationships, their sales, whatever that looks like? And then asking the critical question, is there a value add that we can bring to what they're trying to do that will help them? And in helping them, we see a development impact on the other side of that. And so that is the big kind of call to change the way we think about this. You can imagine if you're starting off 20 years ago, people are questioning, should we even be working with the private sector? To 20 years hence, not only should we be working with the private sector, we should be asking them how they want to make more money and expand their operations. And then we figure out how we can support them. Huge change, huge cultural change over time. And we'll get to what we're working on now, but we've been spending a lot of time from where we sit in a centralized PSE hub office, how we can push the agency along that continuum, get the culture to catch up to the actual policy of the agency, and build the systems that will allow the agency to realize that vision that it had set out. And so, some of the big shifts where you go from CSR, corporate social responsibility, to commercially focused, right? You go from one office in Washington that is responsible. In the past, this office did all the private sector engagement for the agency. Now you see private sector engagement across a variety of different offices and units. So there's been a structural growth there for the agency. At the beginning, private sector engagement was an economic growth phenomenon, right? Oh, it's the economic growth officers that do it. Health officers don't have to do this, and it's not education, and it's not agriculture. Now, and called very explicitly in the policy, it's everybody. Nobody is immune. Nobody can escape it because the private sector is everywhere now, right? And so you can't, if you're health, you're expected to engage the private sector, right? If you're in agriculture, you're definitely expected to engage. Even if you're in humanitarian affairs and response, right? Disaster response, same thing. You got to look for ways to engage the private sector. And then finally, just to kind of round off this evolution, back in the beginning, it was all about partnerships, right? Let's work on an activity. We'll form a partnership around that activity. Like I said, it was, once that activity ended, too often the partnership ended and everybody went their ways, right? We talk about now private sector, not partnerships, but engagement, right? Because the idea here is if you're going to have a conversation with a private sector partner about their interests, the way they look at the world, their commercial interests in particular, that's a deeper conversation. It's a longer conversation, and it's more actually about engagement, which means we bring to the table, we first understand what we can bring to the table, and then we try to plug in where we have a comparative advantage to plug in with what the private sector needs. So, for example, a lot of times private sector comes to USAID, they actually don't want to do a one-off program. They don't want our money, right? And so too often we treat our private sector partners as if they're implementing partners or grantees. They don't want to, but that's the framing that we've had for such a long time that we just kind of, snap back into that. And a lot of times what they're more interested in is the other things we have to offer as an agency. And it's quite considerable, right? But we don't actually lay that out. And so we're trying to do that. For example, in most countries USAID it has one of the best networks in the business community, just by virtue of operating for 60 years in the country. It has better market intelligence than a lot of institutions within that country. We don't actually think about that, right? We have some of the deepest experts in all technical areas. That is a resource that they would love to tap into. We have some of the best reputations, the best connection with government officials that we can leverage. That for a company that's coming from the outside trying to establish themselves is gold. We don't think about that as part of the toolkit that we have to offer to the business community. And so I think our folks are doing a much better job now, like digging into that mindset and like, okay, we got to open up the aperture of the conversation. We got to realize, we all have to realize how they see USAID and the opportunities the USAID can bring to the table to help them, and then lean on those things. So it doesn't have to be a program. It doesn't have to be an initiative. It doesn't have to be an activity or an MOU, or it could be simply we are using our convening authority to get them connected to the right business partners in a country so that they have an easier time of expanding what they want to do. That's engagement, right? It's not a partnership. It's not activity. That's just generalized engagement. So that's part of this big shift in thinking, right? Think about engaging, thinking about bringing value, and it doesn't have to fit in the traditional mold of partnership that we've always tried to fit these discussions in.
That is a great overview of how things have evolved. Although there's been a private sector engagement profile for more than 2 decades, and even longer, as you said, there has now been a shift from things that you referenced, like public-private or corporate social responsibility, to these new ways of expressing it, enterprise-driven development approaches or market-driven development. And even the use of convening power, a term you just used, as a tool that USAID now realizes it has in convening private sector actors with other development actors, and especially in host countries. And now, I think looking forward or looking to the current moment, you're addressing some issues that have persisted even through the development of these approaches and policies over the last 5 to 8 years, that USAID has struggled to learn from some of these effective partnerships and apply that learning to new programs. You've also struggled, as you noted, to move at the speed of the private sector. And now you've launched, the administrator announced a new effort, I believe in late 22, to modernize agency systems to be able to do those things. So I want to talk about the continuing progress. I believe PSE Modernize is the overarching term for several initiatives, and I'll just flag one of those. Maybe you can talk about the whole effort, but also this particular platform that you just launched a couple weeks ago. You did an internal launch for a platform to track the agency's private sector partnerships, bring data to bear for USAID planners, both in the missions and in DC. And you've brought more order to managing PSE partners like customers. So the result is a real system for customer relationship management and knowledge management. Give us a sense of why those changes matter for USAID as well as partners.
Sure. So, the policy came out, and like I said, it had this big vision. But what it didn't have is actually the roadmap to implement the vision, right? And Randy, you'll remember this at the time. The only thing the policy required of all missions was that it do two things. It write its own, what it called an action plan, right? How, as you look at the policy and its requirement for you to start scaling and mainstreaming private sector engagement across your whole programmatic portfolio, how will you do that? Write it in a report, send it back to our office back in Washington. And then at the same time, we needed what was at the time a point of contact, right? Who's going to be your main point of contact, which is fairly standard what USAID has done with when policies come out, right? So I just started in the office at the time when all those action plans were coming back. And we read through every single one of them. There's something like 120 because it covered every mission and every operating unit in Washington. And we actually plotted them out. So we isolated every action that every mission said it wanted to take in its mind to really start thinking about mainstreaming private sector engagement and then scaling it across its portfolio. And it's interesting, we heat mapped the whole thing. So it got you to see in a visual, like what are the actions that missions are thinking of taking on their own that are actually should be institutional issues that we should be taking on back here in Washington. And like you had mentioned the CRM system, which I'll get to in more detail, but the CRM system is basically a sales-based system where you can track your relationships and all your contacts, which doesn't exist at USAID yet. Never existed. We've been doing this work for 20 years, and we don't track our relationships in any enterprise-driven way. It's all very localized and very low tech, still to this day, which is frankly a bit mind-blowing for a global institution that's been at this for 2 decades, right? And so,
and I think I would say the front office is watching this closely, because if you can achieve it here with your work, you might be able to achieve it with other operations within the agency.
So that is actually the deal. But so we took a look at all those actions, and what became pretty clear pretty quickly is the systems of this agency are the major constraint for people to scale and mainstream. And that was the same, that was at the bureau level, was at the, is at the mission level, the bureau level, and the whole enterprise level. You saw the same themes come out, right? And if you boil that all down, we've been doing 60 years, we're 60 some years into the agency's existence. For the last 20 some years, we've been doing private sector engagement. We have never taken a step back and fundamentally rethought the way we do business to allow for private sector engagement, right? It was always done at the margins. It's always an interesting story, because where marginal change even has been made, some really enterprising person said, I'm going to try to fix this. But the problem is they were always trying to fix it on their own or through their own small office. And you can't really change fundamental systems unless you get front office buy-in and you really bring in the support bureaus that need to help you change those systems. HCTM in particular, on the HR side of things, CIO office, on the tech side of things.
HCTM being Human Capital and Talent Management.
Exactly, our HR department. So you have these critical support bureaus who have no incentive in and of themselves to change because they haven't done it. And so the whole idea of Modernize was like, all right, can we, from our office, we'll take a step back, we'll isolate where the pain points are throughout the entire system. We'll be very deliberate in focusing on the biggest pain points, because if you looked at that list that came in from missions and also surveys that we've gotten back, yearly surveys from missions, yearly surveys from the private sector, there is no shortage of pain points on how difficult it is internally, externally to work with the private sector. But with limited resources, we focused on what became 9 separate initiatives that covered everything from the HR system of the agency, the budgeting systems of the agency, procurement, data and reporting on PSE, the community of practice, relationship management, which is one year particular. So 9 initiatives. The mission, as you pointed out, the administrator launched it as an agency-wide reform effort about a year and a half ago, actually. And we've been plugging away ever since. And so we've been moving forward. In fact, this spring, we are going to launch some significant systems changes out of all of that for the agency. And then within our office, develop an office around sustaining those. Because we found out in the past, even when these changes have happened, nobody thought about the long-term sustainability of them, and they kind of fell apart. And so we are being very deliberate. So, you brought up one example. So it's a good example to use, right? Relationship management. We have thousands of relationships with private sector entities at the local level, at the regional level, and obviously with corporates. Again, right now in this agency, there is no system to track. There never has been a system to track those. And what you typically find are people track them through their own Google Sheets, Google Trackers, Google products. I remember when we first wrote this all up and sent it up to the administrator, because we wanted her buy-in to be able to build a new system and an enterprise system for the agency. She scrawled across, she signed the approval memo saying, yeah, we got to build this thing. And she wrote staggering across the front when the first line pointed out what I just pointed out, which was, we've been at this for 20 some years and there is no system and we can't do this. And obviously that brings a bunch of problems, right? Reputational risks for our partners, tons of wasted time and energy, because every time Coca-Cola comes in either to meet the administrator or mission director, everybody starts asking, well, does anybody know what we're doing with Coca-Cola? And then trying to piece it together. So 2 pieces to the solution here. The one, there's a tech solution that we're very proud of. We're building now. It's actually not launched yet. You probably gave our team a bit of a heart attack when you say we just launched it, but we're actually about to launch it. We're shooting for the next town hall for the agency. Actually, the administrator launched it during a town hall, and the dates are coming out. We expect it to be in May or June. So we're looking forward to that launch. So one is an enterprise-based Salesforce-based enterprise customer relationship management system, right? And most of us on this call probably use systems like this, but it will allow us to do everything from tracking contacts to accessing program files in different partnerships, to kind of seeing what we're doing with different companies all around the world in real time. So we have the tech platform, which is named Compass. We've tested it with 3 missions. We're testing it here in Washington. We're actually demoing it for the administrator here in a few weeks. And then we're going to launch it, like I said, in May and June. And then, it's going to take us time to slowly roll it out throughout the agency, but tons of excitement that we're finally going to get some kind of system in place to solve that massive problem. And then on the kind of the human side of it, right, the staff side of it, we know, because we've talked to a lot of interagency, a lot of industry folks, why do these systems fail? Because the change management was not thought about and baked into the design process and really resourced. So we have a change management team that is really thinking through what is the ecosystem into which this platform will work? Who are the main folks that will engage in the system? More importantly, who are the main folks that will enter information into the system? We have this whole network. Those PSE contacts that I talked about that the policy called for, we are upgrading and formalizing those positions into PSE advisors into each mission and to each bureau and to each technical office here in Washington.
You already have, and this is an impressive achievement, you already have PSE points of contact in every mission, and you have relationship managers for different sectors, industries, and so forth. So you're saying that'll become a more formalized system?
Yeah, so the relationship managers, industry leads, we built that over the last 2 years, right? That whole system, we built that. They will be a backbone.
It's remarkable, by the way, for partners to know that for any private sector engagement concern, they can find out who those people are for various reasons, including security. Most technical leads for, say, health or food security are not listed. You have to do research to find out who they are. But with PSE, you know who they are. It's public.
So it was one of the huge pain points was, I am a company. I want to engage with USAID. No idea how to do it. Don't know who to call. Even if I find someone to call, probably the wrong person who will pass me off to another wrong person who will pass me off to another, right? Again, a lot of frustration, like just navigating, just getting to a discussion. Right. And so we're trying to solve for that in a few ways, right? So we created this relationship, what we call the Global Relationship Management Network, 2 parts to it. 1, relationship managers for 30 of right now our most strategic partners. So that's a named human being against a named company. Coca-Cola has in our agency, we're a longtime partner with them, lots of programs. They have a named relationship manager that is public. So if you want to either internally or externally call up that person and get a better sense of what we're doing with Coke, that's an option now that wasn't really available in the past. But there's a lot of other companies we won't have named relationship managers, but they do sit inside of an industry. And so now we have industry leads for the most cross-cutting industries that affect USAID's work, right? Named person. And so if the company isn't listed, you could still call the industry lead and get a sense, are we working with this particular company? What companies are we working with within those industries? And then really internally as a consultant, for anybody that's trying to wrap their head around a new industry or an industry they may want to engage, what are the trends in that industry? Where should I engage? Where's USAID engaging now? And who are the most dynamic partners from their point of view? So they're not gatekeepers by any means, but they're consultants that know that industry more than any other. And so they're available now for those folks that want to learn more about it.
This is so intriguing. I know you and I could go deeper on just this new initiative for knowledge management, which is really breakthrough. But let me just ask one follow-on question, and then I promise, Mike, our listeners will hear more about issues like localization. We're about halfway through, so I know with the second half of this podcast, we want to get to things like localization, some success stories involving partners over the last several years. We want to get to some of the new initiatives that you referenced earlier, like EDGE and the GDA is now called Pathways. So we'll talk about those specific opportunities. But I want to link to a question that Dana Wichterman asked in the Q&A, the chat, that's pretty insightful about whether USAID will give performance review recognition to some of the people you just described, Michael, when they, in Dana's example, when they help companies with business intelligence or they make introductions to the host country government. And I'd like to build on that question by asking basically things like sharing the learning, being responsive to private sector partners. And with this caveat or this kind of understanding of the complexity, business actors don't conform just to country borders. They're often, even if they're a firm that's based in the developing world, they're often based in multiple countries. And they also don't conform to industry silos. And you have to start somewhere. You have to have assignments for your engagement leads. But how do you engage when you have to recognize companies work through supply chains, they cross borders, they work across sectors and industries? And how do you incentivize the support for those complex relationships with your workforce?
Yeah, both great questions. So within PSE Modernize, there's a huge recognition that our HR system, like I said, like other systems, have never really been set up to do this kind of work. And therefore, if you look at the life cycle of employment, right, our hiring systems or our recruitment systems don't really reach into the private sector to recruit folks with significant private sector experience. If we do find them and they go through the recruitment process and the hiring process, it's extremely confusing. It's very bureaucratic, and it's done in a way that most people can't understand the job that's actually available to them, right? So there's a whole piece on that. Once they get in the agency, they run into a bureaucracy that really is not as welcome as it should be. So we're changing that. And then if you look at performance management, probably the greatest lever is changing the way we recognize, reward, award, pay people that come in with a private sector experience, right? Right now, for instance, if you look at the Foreign Service, how Foreign Service officers are promoted, right? And you dig into that, and I was a Foreign Service officer at some point. And I went through that whole system, and a lot of that's built on how many projects, grants or contracts are you managing? How big are they in terms of the overall number? How many staff do you oversee? And the greater those numbers, the better your chance of promotion, right? What was not there, not officially there, it was there kind of culturally there, but not officially there is, how many private sector companies have you engaged? How much have you leveraged as a result of that, right? How much have you, what is the diversification of your private sector portfolio, right? These questions that get to, are we really engaging this in a meaningful way, the private sector, right? And so one of the 9 initiatives under PSE Modernize called the PSE Future Workforce Initiative. And the whole idea there is we have a whole team digging into those systems, getting to the root of those incentives and working to change them or adapt them, I should say, because, government hiring, it's very hard to change a lot of it, but it can be adapted in significant ways so that we do a better job of actually getting people in from the private sector that are comfortable with this work, that understand this world, and will really help drive change in the agency. At the same time, we have a lot of people in the agency that we can train better, that we can also incentivize better. And what we found over time is, and you asked a cultural question earlier, that early culture of like walking the hallways and people asking you openly, why the hell are we working with the private sector? They're part of the problem. Like that changes, you still hear that every now and again, but it catches you off guard when you hear it. So that changes happen, but we still hire people from the development world, right? And so they don't come in with that experience. So we do have to spend a lot of time with that cadre of folks in the agency. And we are re-looking at everything from training to career advancement, development, like I said, the reward and award system. There's a lot that can be done on that side to really move the needle in terms of the incentive structure for everybody. Because if we're going to scale private sector and mainstream it everywhere, you got to change the incentives everywhere. And if you only change it with a certain cadre of people, then you're just going to see more in that narrow lane. And so we're looking at the whole HR system and trying to figure that out.
Great. No, that's huge progress. And it's interesting to note that there really is a trajectory of progress around private sector engagement across multiple administrations. And you and I work together under Administrator Green. So I'd like to turn to some of the things that were sparked in that period of time that have also fed some of the reforms and changes in PSE. You'll recall, Michael, that the Private Sector Engagement Policy and the A&A Strategy, Acquisition Assistance, were released, the first of their kinds in both cases, in the very same month. I think it was December 2018. And the A&A Strategy heavily emphasized simplifying procurement, collaborative design approaches such as co-creation, and using co-creation not only to make an award to a prime recipient, but also emphasizing it at the sub-award level. So being more strategic and transparent with designing sub-awards, often with new or underutilized partners, inexperienced or non-traditional, but especially local partners. So it was diversifying the partner base, empowering local partners. And in this context, an award called Invest was launched, which was a blended finance activity. There was later a similar one called Catalyze. And with Invest, in the early years especially, it really applied all these changes reflected in the A&A strategy and in the new partnerships initiative. It was really aligned, much aligned with NPI. So I just want to get your appraisal of those days, that example. What did we learn, and how did we apply those lessons to other PSE awards beyond that Invest award? Give us also, because it's coming to an end this year after about a 6 or 7 year run, I thought it might be a good chance for you to do a review of Invest and what it accomplished.
Sure. So Invest predated me in the office, although I like I said earlier, I used to run the Development Credit Authority, which was kind of the main finance office for the agency. And so I was part of the early discussions on how to design it, although our office wasn't designing it. But at that time, just first off, there wasn't a lot of those types of instruments around the agency, right? I ran a transactional office with the Development Credit Authority, so we did a lot of finance work, but it was always around using loan guarantees to get local bank lending or funds lending in the local markets. But you needed technical assistance a lot of times to support that. A lot of the technical assistance was actually based in the field. There were no centralized mechanisms that you could buy into in Washington, which was a real deficit for the agency. And so the predecessor office to my current office stepped forward and said, well, we could actually help solve that. And they did. And they started with Invest was the first one. So it was one of the original cross-agency blended finance mechanisms for people to buy into. That's one. Two, Invest was one of the earlier adopters of this co-creation process, right? So bringing in at the beginning of the design process of several different firms to help us think through what that would look like, what the design would look like, to collaborate around that design, which did simplify ultimately the procurement process for such a large mechanism, but also gave us insights that we wouldn't otherwise have had as we designed this thing. And so I think a lot of people look at, that was at the time, you'll recall this, Randy, co-creation was kind of wasn't a new thing, but it was a limited use instrument, very narrowly, mainly in academic type environments, research. And we kind of started pushing that out and say, well, how do we define research? And can we be more broad about how we define research? And so you saw more of these collaboration instruments come into play. I would point back to Invest as being a good example of how we really leaned into that approach for procurement. And then we got it up and running, and it has been, at the technical level, very well subscribed, very well bought into. Came at a time, I think, when you just in the finance space, you just see it growing and growing and growing, right? More interest to engage, not just in the transactional side of things, but in the programmatic side of things. And so Invest was there for a lot of missions to buy into, which they have over and over again. Very well subscribed. It does end this September, and it's got a long history of great programming. I think, one of the things you talked about, non-traditional partners or expanding the partner pool, which you really push for under the new partnership initiative. One of the things Invest tried to solve for, and I think it did, it made a big step in that direction, right? We keep having to go in that direction. This notion of subcontract awards to more diverse partners that are smaller and don't have access to these big contracts, right? And there has been a traditional complaint in the community, and it still goes on today, of subcontracting awards. Even if they're named in contracts, they don't get a lot of business over time because the prime takes up most of the opportunities, even though they're named. What Invest tried to do is actually build what became known as the Finance and Investment Network, which was to kind of curate the community of possible subcontractors that would do the work that fit under the scope of Invest, and to really curate that community and then encourage the prime, which is DAI, to really lean into and use that community with subcontracts. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I recall that they did that better than most in terms of the volume of subcontracting coming out of Invest. And of course, as it comes to an end, we're we're gonna pull all that learning together and certainly share it out. But if you Google invest right now, you'll go straight there. There's plenty out there already. But just to think of, the agency moves slow, but we can keep pushing on this notion of maximizing the partnership base, bringing in different perspectives at the subcontract level. And now, of course, there's a lot in terms of localization, which is a further pushing out, I think, of thinking about partners and partnerships in a different way, smaller, more localized, but way more diverse than what we've traditionally relied on.
Right. Well, I'm glad, Michael, that you mentioned that it is challenging to engage non-traditional partners, whether it's local firms or NGOs, civil society groups. And you do hear complaints, as you mentioned. One of the groups that's been elevating the concerns about how the relationship is managed between prime recipients, traditional or sometimes called legacy partners, with non-traditional partners, often local firms, often small innovators that simply can't break through because they don't have the experience. And that's, of course, what Connected and the Aid Connect platform is meant to assist with. So this is a perfect venue, really, or platform to talk about this. I'll tell you a story and maybe just give me your reaction to this. I was catching up recently with a partner that is a registered U.S. small business, and we also try to elevate U.S. small business for various reasons. We prioritize set-asides often for those U.S. small businesses. But this particular one, and it's not alone, but it is kind of a trend that's just starting, has actually set itself up as a majority African-owned firm and has relocated to the continent. It's already been a successful implementer with donors like FCDO, UK Aid, and has had strong partnerships with host country governments, particularly in West Africa. But the colleague was telling me that the Power Africa opportunity for West Africa came and went, and he could not find a subaward or sub-relationship for the bid on that, was basically left on the curb. And you hear this often. The Unlock Aid organization has been elevating the concerns of partners, either that get invited into a bid but then never used, or they can't break through with the traditional partners that seem, that do have a lot of great experience and development professionals that you and I both know and respect, but they often aren't willing to engage in ways that seem fair and supportive of those small innovators, local partners, and so forth. Any way to break through on that, and give us a sense of how you work with other sector teams like Power Africa, how you support them in moving in that direction?
Yeah, great question. Kind of a loaded question. But I'll answer it. From a distance, we see groups like Unlock Aid, and I can speak from my own personal perspective. I love to see that happen, right? Because the administrator has been very, very strong in leaning into this need to localize our partnership base, diversify it, and localization. I also read as not just localized within the countries themselves, but actually engaging these smaller businesses that do struggle to break into larger contracts as subs. And so I understand their frustration. I actually hear it all the time because a lot of them come in to meet with us and express that frustration. And so I'm glad to see that that frustration is not just acknowledged internally, but also felt. I mean, we all get, I think we all see that issue, see that as a pain point, and want it to be solved. But how do you solve it in a global institution like USAID that has been operating at one way in many, many years? And so there are a lot of very genuine attempts, I think, from this administration, from the last administration, the one before that, to kind of break through and to move the dial into more localized and into smaller engagement. And so I think there's a lot of goodwill there. I think there's some progress there, frankly. And there's also a cultural component to that. We saw that on the private sector engagement side. It takes time to change people's minds. They're used to doing things in a certain way. The systems are entrenched to do a certain thing. They don't change overnight, but they do change over time, right? And so I think there's a lot of good things that are going on that. Of course, we always look for ways to how we in our office can affect that change. But as we do that internally, like I said, the Unlock Aids of the world, the MFANs of the world, we need those outside voices to hold us to account.
Right.
And so I actually think that's just a healthy ecosystem where you hear them looking at it and say, no, we're not moving fast enough, or not we're doing enough, or we pledged to do X and we're not quite there yet. And again, I think this administration, like the ones past, not only accept that, but welcome that and the pressure to do more. Having said that, we in our office do try to look for ways in how we can help address this problem. So for example, the Pathways APS annual program statement that you just mentioned, for those that don't know, but you may have known the old GDA instrument, Global Development Alliance instrument. This was an instrument that was created actually when the first iteration of this office was launched back in 2000. And the idea was we need an instrument that makes it a lot easier to engage the private sector, to have earlier conversations with them about their interests and what they want to do, and to really move the process faster than traditional grants or contracts, because they're not a grantee and they're not a contractor. There's some other entity. And so to the great credit of the folks working on this 20 years ago, they did that. And it's been a great instrument. It has a long and deep history of its use. The challenge has been, and we looked at this when we created Modernize, it was an instrument for 20 years that just kind of changed at the margins as time went along. And I had asked the question, the private sector is not just growing, but moving pretty quickly. How do we actually adapt to it faster and with better and more tools, right? There are lots of authorities within the federal government, both within USAID and outside USAID, that we can actually tap into and develop next generation tools that do make it faster and do make it easier. There is a huge interagency discussion right now on two major topics that affect this. One is customer experience, and there's a whole set of meetings on that. How can we engage our customers from a federal government perspective? A lot of that's the general public. For us, it's the business community. How can we make their engagement experience with USAID a lot faster, a lot better, and a lot more streamlined? So there's a lot of push in that area. And then there's a whole other interagency meeting group on partnerships, asking the question, how can we be better partners with the philanthropic sector, with the private sector? And so there's a lot of great discussion about what Modernize, the spirit of Modernize, which is we got to change. We got to adapt and modernize these systems, because if we keep using old systems for new problems, we're just going to frustrate everybody, including ourselves. And so as part of Modernize, we launched this innovation incubator, which is dedicated folks thinking about next generation tools like the path. So out of that came the Pathways APS, next generation GDA tool, which does allow for earlier engagement, more direct engagement with private sector, not necessarily, although it doesn't exclude it, through an NGO, which has been our traditional way. It dropped, for instance, our matching requirement that we've had for a long time, because that was a bit of a pain point in
where you required the recipient to provide a one-to-one match to what USAID was giving.
Exactly. And so that's a good example of us thinking through next generation tools, next generation approach, new authorities that may be available that across the federal agencies that we should bring in and start using at USAID. The other thing we recently launched, just two quick other mentions that help. And one other thing we recently launched is a new portal off of workwithusaid.gov. Many of you know workwithusaid.gov was launched a few years ago to really rethink the way we engage any kind of partner coming into the agency, whether that's an implementing partner or a grantee or just the general public, to help them navigate USAID better, get to faster answers. We have a portal off that now that we launched a few months ago. And if you go to that, you could Google it. And if you go to it, it's really an attempt to actually speak to the private sector in their terminology and in their language, right? And so going back to where I started talking about laying out what is our value proposition to the private sector that will resonate with them because it's in their language, right? It's not about programs and projects and activities and, log frameworks and metrics. It's about what they care about on the commercial side. And so we launched that. We have behind that this concierge service. So for example, if small business wants to work with USAID, has no idea how to navigate the agency, they go to work with USAID.gov. They actually go on the corporate side of that, and then they can start reading about how they can engage, where they can engage. What if they go into the sector, the industry, they can see how others have engaged. And at the end of it, if they want to talk to a human being, imagine, they can click a button and we'll get in contact with them and help them navigate further and or help them get to the where they say, you know what, I want business. I want to do business with USAID. Okay, that's not partnership, that's somewhere else. And we don't want to waste your time. And so another way we're thinking about at least how to help small businesses, non-traditional partners, better navigate the agency and at least have a better customer experience. Maybe they don't get business, maybe there's not a partnership, which is fine, but they shouldn't have to go through 15 different people and too many meetings and phone calls to find out our interests are not aligned. I think we can get to that for a lot of people a lot faster.
Right. Well, let me just quickly respond on a couple of things. First, congratulations on EDGE, which I know the administrator announced, I think it was at Davos in early 23. And you have done 2 rounds and issued several dozen awards under EDGE, which is a real accomplishment. And I would encourage listeners, viewers, to go to your website, which has been dropped in a couple of times, to look at some of the awards and see the highlights of what's being done there to engage many of them local host country private sector actors in development activities. Secondly, just a reminder that PSE Modernize, the website is there. Michael has covered probably more than half of the 9 initiatives under PSE Modernize, including the one you just discussed. But I want to hopefully fit in one last question before we finish. I was going to ask you about the role of philanthropic actors and NGOs, which, as you know, used to really lead on the Global Development Alliance. They were often the prime recipients. And the private sector actor was more of a subrecipient or a sort of adjacent partner. Now it's shifted over several years to where the private sector actor is usually the prime recipient. So I first want to ask about the continuing role of non-governmental organizations, nonprofits in private sector engagement. There seems to be less of a role now, but I want to combine this, and forgive me for a two-fisted question here, with a question that Ramsey Day, our former colleague, has put in the chat about the relationship with the Development Finance Corporation. And just for listeners' awareness, the USDFC was created when Administrator Green served at USAID and through federal legislation combining OPIC with the Development Credit Authority, which you used to lead. And so the combination of those 2 agencies created the USDFC. So let me ask the second part of the question, and I'll bring one quick example of an NGO that's played a role here. Habitat for Humanity has been leading in opening new markets in a critical development sector, which is housing and shelter. And full disclosure, I have worked with Habitat over the last couple of years, and they've actually been a client of Connected as well. They have been working for more than a decade now on what's called Microbuild. Microbuild is a program that works through microfinance organizations around the world, and I think it's more than 30 countries now, to create instruments, whether it's a micro mortgage or simply access to credit to improve housing, improve land tenure or solve land tenure issues, all kinds of things. And the USDFC recognized this. I think OPIC initially did some work with Microbuild, but then the USDFC invested more than $90 million in the current program and is now looking at an additional investment in a Microbuild too. Again, all this under Habitat for Humanity and its global support and technical advice to microfinance institutions doing these loans. So all that is to ask you, Michael, is there still a role for USAID looking to work through NGOs like Habitat in this kind of private sector engagement work? And secondly, how is the relationship going with the DFC? Are you finding ways to support their portfolios? Big questions,
Sure.
a big essay question for you.
All in a few minutes. I'll take them in reverse order. So as folks may know, 6 years ago now, Congress passed the BUILD Act to create the DFC, and the creation was basically the old OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and the shop I was running in USAID, which was the agency's only transactional shop, which was the Development Credit Authority. We moved it out per the bill and put it over to the DFC, which created a significant hole in the agency in terms of its ability to transact. The portfolio had been growing significantly. So anyway, we worked very hard to create a unit over in the DFC that's still open for the transaction that USAID brings into the DFC. It's called the Mission Transaction Unit. And frankly, to our great surprise, it's working way better than we thought it would, because when you cross over interagency barriers to actually do programmatic work, it gets very messy, very bureaucratic, very fast. The great news is the agency is still reaching into the DFC to do the same type of deals used to do under DCA. Lots of growing pains, lots of pain points, but we have a whole team here working on those constantly. So I think by and large, it's been a great relationship. There are a lot of touch points that we didn't have in the OPIC days that we do have now. That has helped, structural, including the administrators, the vice chair of the board of directors at the DFC. That helps a lot. The chief development officer is a senior USAID foreign service officer. That helps a lot. And then this unit. So it's going well. In terms of your question on NGOs or other actors, I do think they have a role in this space. You're right. The Pathways APS no longer requires what the GDA did, which typically was you would work through one of these groups and the private sector. We can work with the private sector directly. But again, going back to where I started in the vision of the policy, right? We need to engage the private sector in a different way, more on their commercial terms, and then figuring out what we bring to the table to support that. If I were an NGO running an NGO, if I could do some of that work for USAID and package it, USAID would love that, right? Because it is very time and labor intensive, and people don't have enough time to do it. And we hear that all the time. This new vision of yours, it takes a lot of time. It takes a big network. And so I do think there's a role for third parties there to be like, okay, I got a big network of corporates that I work with. Maybe I can help in helping shaping that common vision and cut through a lot of time that it would take USAID to do that. So that's the opportunity set, I think, where people can play that would be very helpful and would be very welcome for resource and time constraint missions, which are basically all of our missions. So that's the second one. Trying to remember the first question.
I think you covered both, because it was really the relationship with the DFC.
Oh, the DFC, the role of the NGO. And it wasn't a question, but you mentioned EDGE. Yes, we're very happy. The administrator helped launch EDGE, as you pointed out. Just a quick note on the EDGE fund itself. 2 rounds, $100 million already. Why we created the EDGE fund? One of the pain points was there is no unearmarked funding for this type of work, and we see a lot of opportunities from the private sector pass us by because the money's not available. That was the driving reason to create EDGE. The administrator found that type of money, which is quite rare, which is significant. And then we're using it to incentivize leaning into that call in the policy itself, that leaning into the commercial side of business and their comparative advantage. We reward that through the EDGE fund, lift them up to show the agency, look, it can be done. It is being done. We all got to do more of it.
Great.
And Mike, just about to turn it back over to you. Michael, thank you. This has been a fully packed conversation, and wish we had more time. Hopefully our listeners do too. But this has been very informative. You're very transparent about the work of the agency, sharing the changes that are internal, being very open about how you're improving systems. And so thank you. I just want to thank you before handing it back to you, Mike.
Thank you. And Randy, thank you for putting this show together. It sounds like we need to have a follow-on episode, Michael, maybe after the launch of the upcoming platform. Randy, this was really great. I enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot. Michael, thank you for taking some time away from your day to share the important work you and your team are doing to support private sector engagement with USAID. And thank you to you and your entire team, your colleagues at USAID, for the important work that you all do every day. Really appreciate you being on the show, and hope everyone enjoyed this and learned a little bit about how they can better engage with USAID and support the private sector engagement work Michael and his team are working on there. So thank you so much to everyone.
Anytime. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Mike.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Aid Market Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with Mike Shanley on LinkedIn to stay updated on the latest USAID funding trends.